Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review, the podcast about book clubs and the books that get people talking. I'm Kate, and as this episode is coming out around Valentine's Day, I thought it would be the perfect moment to chat to someone who loves books as much as I do, and, as I imagine listeners, as much as you do. Daisy Buchanan is an award-winning journalist, author and broadcaster. She hosts the chart-topping podcast You're Booked, where she interviews legendary writers from all over the world about their reading habits. If you haven't listened to her podcast yet, you might have heard her on Women's Hour, Times Radio or Good Morning Britain, or encountered her at literary festivals, where she regularly chairs events. She's also the author of several best-selling novels, including Insatiable and Pity Party. And as if all that wasn't enough, she has a new non-fiction book out called Read Yourself Happy. She joined me over Zoom to talk books, Jilly Cooper, favourite romance recommendations, why we shouldn't be afraid of a little life by Hanya Yanagihara, and much, much more. But first, this episode is sponsored by Serious Readers, the makers of seriously good reading lamps. Listeners, as you may know, I am a devoted fan of these lamps, which use daylight wavelength technology that replicates the daylight spectrum. I have two, the HD desk lamp and the HD floor lamp, which I keep by my bed. I love them because when I use them, it feels like my eyes can relax. They're getting exactly the light that they need, and I find it easier to focus without feeling in any way effortful. The other thing I appreciate is that serious readers have put a lot of thought into the functionality, making the lamps incredibly easy to adjust and control. And I very much like the thought that getting the right light is helping protect my eyes from eye strain. If you're interested to give them a try, visit seriousreaders.com/BCR, and you can take advantage of our offer code BCR, which will give you £150 off any HD light and free UK delivery. You also get a 30-day trial period, so you can give them a go and see how you get on. I'll put the link and the code in the show notes. Okay, so we've got the lighting sorted. How about our love lives? As you're about to find out in the interview with Daisy, I've been happily married for many years to a man I love very much, even though he's not a reader. That must be how I know I love him. I love him despite the snoring and the non-reading. Anyway, probably TMI. But for any listeners out there who are single and looking for a partner, I've recently come across a new website I'd love to share with you called Book Lovers. It's a dating site for people who love books. It's run by May and David, two enthusiastic readers who realised there was a place in the dating world for people who share a love of books. It's free to create your profile and browse through the other members. You can also contact people for free during your first 2 days. After that, it's up to you to decide if you want to become a paying subscriber. And to help you out with that, you can use the code BookClubReview to get 10% off your subscription. Head to www.booklovers.dating, link in the show notes, and don't forget your code BookClubReview if you do decide to sign up. I think it's a brilliant idea, and I'm mildly regretful I'm not going to get to use it myself, but I hope that if you give it a try, you'll find your perfect match. Maybe 2 Book Club Review listeners will find love. If that happens, please do get in touch. Okay, over to Daisy and on with the show. I feel excited and intimidated to have such an incredibly bookish person on the show.
It's funny because I often don't feel all that bookish, and often during the podcast, I'm really stunned and delighted by the breadth of the guests' reading, and quite often I think, oh my goodness, I haven't read that. And I think that's the beauty of books and the joy of books, is that you can have 2 very well-read people. Let's say that's you and me. We're 2 very well-read people in a Zoom room, and we might have completely different spheres of reading interest, and there'll be thrilling points where they connect and other thrilling points where we can recommend exciting things to each other. But I'd love that all the books in the world, I think, are in conversation with each other, to sound a bit of a hippie about it, and anyone can join in.
Well, I wanted to test out a little theory I had today about readers. I was thinking about how I always like to have a book on me, and actually a lot of the time I just quite like having books near me, and I thought most of the time if I reach out my hand I would probably be able to put it on 2 or 3 books. So as an example, without any prep, I was tempted to prep, but I didn't prep. I just sat down at the desk where my computer was to see whatever I find. I've got a copy of Read Yourself Happy, which is not surprising. I've got a copy of The Flat Share by Beth O'Leary, which we must come on to.
Oh, I love that book. I love her.
I've got a copy of Strange Beach by Oluwaseun Olaweola, which is a book of poetry. Because in a fit of enthusiasm this year, I signed up to the Fitzcarraldo poetry subscription because I wanted this to be the year that I read more poetry. And this is the first one that's come, and I have to say I'm incredibly intimidated.
Wow. The Fitzcarraldo poetry subscription, you are not messing around.
I know.
That is an intellectual heavyweight
I actually
business.
think maybe I need to work my way up to it. But on the other hand, the book is so beautiful. I'm happy at least to be in its presence. And finally, a copy of a book called The Piranha Club, Power and Influence in Formula One, which is nothing to do with me.
Oh, I'm intrigued though. Really intrigued.
How about you? If you were to stretch out your hand, have you got any books near you? And if so, what are they?
I am in my sitting room where I am surrounded by books, but the books I can touch are a pile I've gathered of my most favourite books on Read Yourself Happy business. I've got Read Yourself Happy on my knee for reference. And here is my pile. On this pile of all-time beloved favourite books, Love Nina by Nina Stibbe.
Oh, such a good one.
Rachel's Holiday by Marion Keyes. Now, this is the anniversary edition. I do have my first edition of Rachel's Holiday, which I found in a charity shop when I was about 15, is a beautiful cream and gold hardback that's gone a bit greyish. I think there was a dust jacket once, but I don't know where it is. This is a bit more robust. Happy All the Time by Laurie Colwyn. This is the book that I feel doesn't get read enough.
Love that.
I think it's such a joy and a delight. Are you a Colwyn head also?
Yeah, but I was late to it. It was recommended to me by Chrissy Ryan at Book Bar. And on her
Chrissy's
advice,
brilliant.
I read it and was so happy I did.
I have hit The Girl with the Lounging Voice by Abby DeRay, just because I think Dunny is one of my all-time favourite heroines. And this is the book where I think when it came out, and I was having one of those attacks of conscience and thinking, oh, this is about forced marriage in Nigeria and it's all going to be really earnest and horrible and heartbreaking, but I should read it and it's really bad I don't read more things like this. And what I got was an absolutely joyous, exhilarating, wild ride where I was always either grinning or weeping because Dunny's, her lounging voice, it's one of the best examples of a voice in fiction that I know. There's no one that I've rooted for so hard. There were so many points where I just wanted to stand up and say, yes, go on. So it draws our attention to something quite sobering, but it is heaven to read and a pleasure to read. It's such an unexpectedly happy book. Very, 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 very different book, but maybe not unlike A Little Life, where you think, oh, it's just going to be so relentlessly harrowing and dreadful. And then you're stunned by its lightness. A very precious possession is now I've got my proof copy of Everything I Know About Love by Dolly Alderton, which is a friend I often return to. And this is Rivals by Jilly Cooper. And I know podcast is not the friendliest medium to this. This was signed. I went for lunch at Jilly Cooper's house and we both had an awful lot of champagne and white wine. And Jilly's beautiful handwriting, I think it says, because also Jilly is, I don't know if you've ever had the pleasure, a really prolific and gorgeous correspondent. And there is nothing lovelier than Jilly Mail. And every so often, and especially with Rivals coming out, being a journalist, I got the odd, we're looking for someone to write about how much they love Jilly Cooper. Like, me, yes, please, me. And if Jilly saw it, she'd send a lovely card. But my handwriting isn't good or readable. And Jilly's is equally challenging. So my husband is very good at deciphering Jilly Mail, as we call it. But yes, this is the one that if the house was burning down, I'd go back in for it.
Well, I wanted to ask you quickly about the Jilly Cooper Book Club. If listeners scroll back far enough through our archive, they'll find an interview we did a few years ago with Kat Brown, who is a member of the Jilly Cooper Book Club. And that was the first time I'd heard about it. And it was so wonderful having her on and talking about the fun and the joie de vivre of these books, but also this camaraderie of this group, which I'd loved hearing about.
I think Kat must have been our founder member. And when I joined, it was at quite an odd time because I was doing a job I really, really hated and felt very, very anxious in. And I'd handed in my notice. Basically, I had fired myself from the job. I was in such a pitch of shit. And these amazing women, and it's a surprisingly eclectic group of women, they just gathered. And I think it's something about loving Jilly Cooper books. And I think this is true of all Jilly fans. I think it's very easy to be kind to someone when they're feeling low. And we always say about friendship, like, oh, we want people to really step in when things are bleak and dark and difficult, to be very sympathetic. I would say actually the really precious friends are the ones that you want to drink actual metaphorical champagne with all the time. And I stopped drinking alcohol about 2.5 years ago, but I love the idea of champagne, and the Jilly Cooper book club is all the champagne I need. Jilly is high-low. To write what she writes the way she does, you've got to be incredibly smart. Any scraps I know about poetry and classical music are from those books. And actually that was so lovely about Rivals coming out, because you heard from a lot of people really appreciating her and appreciating just how talented you have to be to write these absolutely thrilling, exhilarating, gorgeous, fun page turners. What I think Jilly does so well is it's almost like being a teenager and going to a party with a spot on your chin. And yet going to that party can be the making of you, and you can absolutely Cinderella it, and you can hook up with whoever you want to hook up. But I think the big thing as well is that Jilly, she was the first writer who didn't write about sex happening to women in a tragic way, or women, their desirability being the point. The women in those books want. And sometimes they're afraid to say that, and sometimes they really go for it. But I think that's the joy and the fun of it all.
Well, I think there's been a lot of terrible things happening in the news over the past year. But on the other side, one of the great delights of 2024 for me was that it was the year of Jilly Cooper. And it just made me so happy.
I just saw the production company on Instagram shared a picture of their the script meeting for the second series with Jilly in the middle. I can't wait.
Me neither. See, you just never know. You never know what nice things are going to happen.
Have you done it yet?
Yeah. And I loved listening to your booked episode you did where you had a chat with Jilly. Listening to your show, you sound incredibly relaxed and at ease, interviewing everyone from David Nichols and Curtis Sittenfeld to Lauren Groff, Elif Shafak, Andrew Sean Greer. Has that become normal to you now? What are your tips if you encounter a writer whose books you've really loved? Is it hard to keep your inner fangirl in check?
Well, I think that's the absolute joy of talking to authors, because books are the greatest leveller. I'm always a bit nervous. It was interesting with Lauren Groff, because for some reason I did feel very intimidated by her. I don't know if it's more Americans. I just assume that, oh, you're going to be really confident, Ivy League and all the schooling and also her prolificness and her many, many awards. And she was one of the most relaxing, kind, generous, open people. She just wants to talk about what she loves. My favourite people are readers. Writers are, by and large, readers. I don't think you can write if you don't read. And every single writer that I talk to has been an excited reader, and they still are. The episode we did with Marion Keyes, it was just this gorgeous, giddy hour of, oh, and have you read this, and have you read this, and oh my goodness. And then it was funny talking to Leanne Moriarty and coming full circle. And again, Leanne Moriarty is someone where I thought, if anyone could be a bit terrifying and grand, it would be her. But no, so warm and lovely and down to earth. I'm going to do some horrific name dropping. Anne Patchett once said to me, and I would say she's possibly one of the most famous writers we have. She said, you can't be a famous writer. You can only be famous for a writer. And I really took that and ran with that and thought, yeah, she's absolutely on the money. Like, even if you saw Margaret Atwood on the street, you might approach her. You're more likely to think, oh, that lady looks like Margaret Atwood, and then go about your day.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's a relatively niche subset of celebrity, isn't it? Famous authors. Back to books and Read Yourself Happy, which I've had such a happy time reading these past 2 days. But it did surprise me, because looking at everything you've achieved and listening to you interviewing all these incredibly famous authors on your podcast, I would never have guessed that you're someone who suffers from anxiety. Can you tell us more about that and why you wanted to write this book, which explores reading and how it helps you process emotions?
That's a very generous thing to say. And it almost makes me want to laugh, because it's funny, isn't it, what we get good at masking and how we cope. Maybe that's it, because I've not really talked about this before. It's something I just thought of, that I really struggled at school when I was little. I was reading fairly early, and I was always quite nerdy and I suppose quite bookish. I was just a bit sensitive and overwhelmed. And I realised that when the playground felt so chaotic and scary and everything was beyond my control, books were the safe place. Books I got to experience the story at my own pace and really feel good, calm, happy feelings in my body and just be gripped and transported and totally focused on something else. But also, I wonder as well whether it was the books that made me want to do something about the anxiety. Because I remember really quite early on thinking, I want to grow up and have the freedom to do whatever I choose as soon as I can. And I want to travel and have adventures. And obviously, all of those aspirations would have come from stories and this sense that everyone I was reading about was undergoing some big personal challenge. I guess just thinking of The Secret Garden, and Mary is ill and delicate and she's not supposed to be up and wandering around. But if she didn't, there would be absolutely no story there. Or Ballet Shoes, which is really in my head because I just saw the production at the National Theatre for the second time
yesterday. Is it good? I thought it looked so good.
It's gorgeous. And it's funny because it's very different from the book in lots of ways. And the characters are slightly different, I think, to make them more appealing to children today, which absolutely makes sense to me. But I suppose I was thinking about how much of an impact that story had on my relationship with money, and still does. Lots of my anxiety, I just wanted to go out to work. And here's a spoiler, but at the very end, when Posey goes to Paris and Pauline goes to Hollywood, I thought, well, yes, that's the natural order of things. And I'd quite like to go to Hollywood and have a career when I'm 15. And it was only reading it as an adult, and I thought, oh my goodness, that's so sad. They're all so young and they're all going to be so far from each other. But yeah, I think reading soothed my anxiety, and reading also made me think, I can't live like this forever. I have got to really step into fear and experience it and accept that it's going to be there if I'm going to have any kind of exciting life and be like a girl in the book.
Your publishers have summed it up very nicely. In a hectic world that can feel uncertain and overwhelming, Daisy Buchanan offers the perfect antidote to all the noise, inviting us to discover the literary worlds that have helped her survive and thrive. I found it incredibly accessible and relatable because through sharing those things that you struggled with, I think most people to a greater or lesser degree share some of these feelings. And that delight of seeing your own safety net that you built for yourself with all of these books. And then these fantastic themed recommendations, right? Chapter by chapter, by emotion. So read yourself calm, read yourself happy, read yourself funnier, that allow you to weave in all these different themed recommendations.
I'm really, really glad that you said it feels accessible, because that's what I want the most. And I think, now more than ever, it is very hard to make time for this, that reading is that thing we all know we should be doing more of. And when I talk to people about books, sometimes I look worried and say, oh, I've not read anything for ages, or the last thing I read, it was something I found on TikTok. I haven't read Orbital yet, or I haven't read this, or I've not read enough Dickens. And really, all I want to do with this book is reclaim reading for us and reading for pleasure for us, and to say, look, read for pleasure first. There are so many terrible, pernicious things that want to suck the attention from us. And I think when we read for pleasure, we're doing something radical, because we're gifting our attention right back to ourselves. I think we're so used to feeling as though everything's got to be a challenge and everything's got to be hard and we've really got to push through. And what I hope to do here is say there might be times in your reading life when you want to read a lot of Dickens, if you haven't yet, but start with the feel-good thing. And it completely depends on you. If you're like me, it might be reading Ballet Shoes again for the 10th time, or going back to beloved Jilly Cooper. But, let's say, well, it's like that Formula One book on your pile. You might be someone who wants to read, but is absolutely fascinated and obsessed by Formula One. Then that's your book. I really, really love an oral history, and I really like reading about music. As one, I've just read The Come Up by Jonathan Abrams, which is an oral history of hip hop. And it's so good and gossipy and contradictory. And it is so interesting about what's happening in America in the late 20th century and beyond. There are 2 Dr. Dre's, which gets very confusing. But also because it captures the way people speak and the way lots of different people speak, and you really get your ear. And there's another brilliant book in that vein called I Want My MTV, I think by Rob Tannenbaum. It's about music videos in the 80s, how MTV got made. It's really bitchy. It's really gossipy. Everyone contradicts everyone. The only thing anyone can agree on is that Toto did the most cocaine. But, that's not a highbrow book, but I felt so informed. It's a really good, specific slice of social history,
Yeah.
something that I really love and I'm really interested in. Pop music. I don't know if you know Miranda Sawyer's book, Uncommon People, which came out, I think, just before Christmas, which is the history of Britpop in 11 songs. And again, that's it. And Miranda Sawyer is a brilliant journalist and she writes to be read. She's not delivering the quite intense, dense prose you've got to wade through. She knows how to grab your attention with headlines. But she's writing about the 90s through a lens. So exactly what was happening in life when these songs were being made. And it's really, I love that period of history that maybe isn't quite history yet.
I love the way that you're like a book recommendations machine. I'm glad I'm recording this conversation so I can go back to them all later. Let's go to some recommendations that are in the book. I did think, because it was Valentine's Day, we might zoom in a little bit on Read Yourself Romantic, which is a really lovely chapter where you're talking about your own love story and then the way that books can teach us about different kinds of romantic love. Talk us through some of the books that you've recommended, your favourite books about love.
In order, my favourite books about love: Early Morning Riser by Katherine Heine. My goodness, is she funny, clever and warm, and the observations are just, I think she's a genius, I really do. But this book is filled with sweetness. Jane moves, I think, from New York and hires or meets Duncan, the handyman. He's a bit older than she is, but incredibly charming and incredibly good looking. And they hook up straight away. And within days of them getting together and becoming a couple, it becomes apparent to Jane that Duncan has slept with everyone in town. And his first wife, who's very bossy, still looms large in his life. And she's got a lot of opinions and wants to spend a lot of time with the pair of them. And Duncan's got a business partner called Jimmy, who Jane struggles with because Jimmy, I think, has some intellectual disabilities and lives with his mother. And he works for Duncan. And Jimmy isn't quite able to take care of himself. And the community chip in. And all Jane really wants is to spend time, just her and Duncan. And it never happens. But the book is about life happening, I guess, and Jane growing up and Jane coming to accept it. And she has a family and she starts to realise there is so much more to love than romantic love. But it is also so funny. I can't stress that enough. I think it's a really grown-up love story.
Yeah, it's such a lovely example of love being not quite what you expect.
And actually, I think everything on this list is in that theme. I've got Larry's Party by Carol Shields, which I think was the first book to win the first Women's Prize. And it's unusual because Carol Shields is writing through the perspective of Larry, who is a dude. And it's, again, his life begins when he's 26 and we see him over the course of 3 romantic relationships. And I think maybe that's it with love stories. It's like watching couples therapy, isn't it? You get to see what are the patterns he keeps repeating? How do these things overlap? Does he ever learn? I love those books where you can see so many gorgeous glimpses of interiors that you never quite get to visit fully. You know there are characters with more going on and lots to say. It's like looking at a very busy people painting, like zeroing in on one of the figures in Déjeuner sur l'herbe and go like, okay, I'm going to follow that one, but there are other people. It's about the fullness of a life. I think I had Richard Osman on the What Did You Do Yesterday podcast, which I'm obsessed with, saying that people believe that it is the big dramatic moments that are worth writing about that make up a life. But no, it's just that over the course of a day, within the postcode that I'm sitting in, any number of people are going on the second date with the person they'll marry, or they've done the thing at work that's going to lead to their promotion, or they're about to quit, or they're putting something in place for a big move. These are the details of love. And I don't love love stories where there are lots of grand romantic gestures. I think I just want the pottering and the tenderness. I didn't put A Little Life in this list, but that's what I think about when I think about love stories. I'd love just 300 pages on Jude and Wilhelm in that book, pottering about in their flat, making things to eat and enjoying each other's company and having companionable silences.
I liked your kind of honest about your own hesitations about reading that book, which I share to the degree that I haven't read it yet.
I mean, it's so funny, isn't it? Because people say, like, you have to read this, you'll cry for a year.
Yeah, that's
You'll
right.
never be able to read it. You'll be so sad, you'll pluck your own eyes out.
I know.
You'll have to go into a hole in the bottom of a garden like a tortoise because you'll be so sad. It'll be awful. It is the moments of joy and light and tenderness that make it so lovely. And also, I was very surprised by just how much of a page turner it is. Because of the reputation it had, I thought, oh, so it's going to be very dense and very literary, and I'll feel stupid before I feel sad. I won't follow it. But this is a horrible word for a lovely thing. Readable. It is very readable. And when it begins, it feels so fun. You know, they're all in New York, they're making art, they're hanging out. You're kind of seeing these young men who've got this exciting future ahead of them. And I think the saddest thing is not what happens to Jude, which is devastating and awful, but it's that he is loved so much and he cannot feel it.
Yeah, which is very
There's a spoiler.
I feel like no matter what I read, I always tell myself it couldn't possibly be as bad as The Road, which I did once for book club years ago, and I've never quite got over.
Oh, wow.
The Cormac McCarthy book.
And I always get Cormac McCarthy mixed up with Colm to Bean, which meant that when I read Brooklyn, I was really like, I don't know. And then I was pleased and delighted. Oh, this is lovely. This is great.
Not nearly as bad as you were stealing yourself for.
Other love stories I've got here are Us by David Nicholls, which I adore. And I love One Day. I interviewed David Nicholls for this chapter, and I got to go and hang out. And we sat in his garden on a sunny day and had Florentines. Really, the whole book was a contrived excuse to do that and to try and find a way to make that happen. I'm not apologising. But what I love about Us is it's about the end of love and a bit of a relationship that we so rarely get to see. And I think the very first time I read it, I was a bit too young for it. And I wanted Connie and Douglas to be together. So if you haven't read it, Connie and Douglas have been married for 25 years and they've got a teenage son called Albie. And Connie thinks things have run their course, but they've got this big family trip planned. And it's the last one before Albie goes off to university. And they're doing the grand tour of Europe. And Douglas does believe there's still hope and he really wants it to work. And it's about three people evolving into a different kind of love. You see all the ways they've loved each other and all the people that they've been. It's sad, but it is also funny. It's gorgeous. There's an essay collection I really love called Wedding Toast I'll Never Give by Ada Calhoun. He's one of my favourites. She's a really brilliant, smart American writer who writes great non-fiction, although her first novel, I think, is about to come out and I'm desperate to read it. And the first essay comes from her saying she goes to weddings and the toasts are always, I will love you until the universe ends and the earth as we know it collapses, and through fire and disaster, darling, I will be there. And again, it's just what we were talking about a second ago. She's saying, but that's not love. Love is loving someone when they have repeatedly misbooked a flight and it costs you hundreds of dollars. Or love is loving someone when they have left their coat in the middle of the floor for no reason. Again, or, whatever it is. Humans are always going to drive each other crazy in tiny ways. And love is being able to build that into the fabric of what you have. And then Dolly's book, Everything I Know About Love. I was younger when I first read that. And it is like visiting the people I've been and maybe the people that I'm going to be. And every time I think, how is she so wise? How is she so wise? Because it came out a little while ago. And I think it's, again, I suppose, it's the same as Early Morning Riser, where we dream of romantic love. And romantic love is so much fun, but there are so many other kinds of love that are rich and deep and lasting and meaningful, and they're the ones we can't do without.
Laura and I read her latest book, Good Material, quite recently, which we both loved. And that's a very interesting take on a relationship.
I loved it. I really loved Andy. I often think about, there's a bit where, on account of the breakup, Andy has marshalled everyone for a night out and he tries to do it again and no one wants to go on the night out. Everyone has got children to look after or work commitments or something to do. It's really interesting talking about men and their friendship with other men. And I know at the moment there's lots of anxiety about how connected we are and how hard it is. And I thought that Andy's friendships were so beautifully drawn and so real. And also, I suppose that's a book about a man who's made himself the main character and then his ex-girlfriend, and her story is more vivid than we could imagine. It structurally, it reminded me a lot of Fleischman is in Trouble, which I also loved.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting as well that you would think you wouldn't recommend. It's a book that deals with the aftermath of a breakup and the grief and loss and all of those things. I mean, it's incredibly funny and warm and readable, to use that word. But in fact, the love that comes through it is actually them discovering for themselves what they really want, and that maybe that wasn't what they had or what they thought they had. And that journey that they go on, these characters, as you say, it's so wise. And I was so happy to have read it.
It's funny, isn't it? Some years ago, I went to a friend's wedding and I knew an ex-boyfriend would be there, and it ended very badly. And it was amazing at that wedding because I've always had this, wanting closure, as the kids say, and think, he'd done me wrong and we're going to have the conversation that sort of exonerates me and fixes everything and we're all good and fine. And then at that wedding, I was looking at him thinking, you could have been the nicest man in the world and it wouldn't have worked. And if we were still together now, we shouldn't be together. And that's not about who did what to who. That's about fundamental incompatibility. And, it was like a real, almost transcendent moment. And then I thought, I'm not going to badger this poor man to get this thing. I'm going to go back and sit with my husband, who I love, who I want to have conversations with.
Well, I'm glad you brought up your husband. I was slightly jealous reading about your relationship with your husband, only because he's also a reader. And I didn't think to look for a reader when I was auditioning life partners, in my younger years. And so I ended up with someone who doesn't read at all. It's so not his thing. He reads, but he would never read a book. If I ever found him reading a book, I would assume that he'd been replaced by aliens. But that's not your experience. You have this lovely time with someone who loves reading as much as you do. What's that like?
I mean, I've not met your partner, but I love a challenge. I'm sure there's a book out there that would
Daisy,
do that.
I cannot
I'm sure
tell you.
You have done the work.
I have. And I believe to my soul, to my core, that there is a book there for everybody, but I have not found his book, not yet.
It was sheer good luck. And I think I'd always probably gone out with people who were not very much like me at all, because I thought, opposites attract. That's what you do. And I think what it was about when I met Dale, my husband, he was the first person I dated where he wanted me to tell him what I love to read, and he wanted to go away and read it. It wasn't just I'm the reader, here's what I suggest, here's what I prescribe. And it was really lovely discovering books together. A couple of years ago, I think he heard about it first. He found this book by a writer called Linda Rosencrantz called Peter Hujar's Day, and it's non-fiction. It's incredibly short. Linda Rosencrantz was a writer, and she wanted to do a project where all the artists of her acquaintance submitted a kind of report of the previous 24 hours, because she's like, you all do quite interesting things. I want to know what you do and where you go. Peter Hujar did not hand his in, so she called him over and he came round to her apartment and said, right, what did you do yesterday? Let's go over it in granular detail. And the book is just the transcript of that conversation. Some of it is brilliantly gossipy. He's seeing William Burroughs and Susan Sontag. Some of it he's spending a lot of money on Chinese food and then about 0.5 cent on a packet of cigarettes. But it's really gripping, even though nothing happens. So Dale stumbles upon this and I read it and we both love it. And we've definitely recommended it to people, but it feels like a secret that we're in on, a good, weird book. And I found out yesterday, Peter Hujar's Day, the movie, is going to Sundance. They have adapted it. It's going to have Ben Whishaw in it as Peter Hujar.
I loved this little passage that made me laugh out loud when I came to it in Read Yourself Romantic. You're talking about your previous boyfriends who were book lovers. I've been burned romantically by book lovers before. Admittedly, this was my fault. I'm happy to read anything recommended to me, and some of my exes widened my literary horizons. To impress various bad boyfriends, I read a lot of good books. Most of Martin Amis, a lot of Murakami, the poetry of John Donne, a little Bukowski, some Irvine Welsh, and the autobiography of former Hull City midfielder Dean Windass.
I remember, I think that was the last book in the pile, and it was a very long Sunday. And do you know what? It was definitely before I had an iPhone. And I think that now my phone is such a source of stress and anxiety and relentless demands on my time. I'd rather reread the Dean Windass book than spend as much time on my phone as I do.
Well, it's that thing, isn't it? Is that books give you something and strangely our phones sort of take away.
It's so bizarre, the connections that you make. I think there was a day when there was a French playwright who was an answer on University Challenge. Dale got the answer right. And I remember thinking, oh, that's very impressive. And then that poet came up I just read by Grand Central Station, I Sat Down and Wept by Elizabeth Smart. And I thought, oh, there's Mentionnitis. And then I I read another book, Camp by Paul Barker, which is huge fun. And it came up in that. And I thought that interconnectedness of things, it's like being on the internet, but doing it at your own pace. And then the other weird thing, so went away for a week to write. I did not get nearly enough writing done. But the books I grabbed that I'd had in my possession for ages were the Elizabeth Smart and a book of essays called Notes from the Hen House by Elspeth Barker, who wrote O Caledonia. Have you read By Grand Central Station?
I have, actually. I did it for book club a long time ago.
Oh,
a fox tore at my vitals.
It wasn't what I was expecting. I wanted to love it more than I did. I sort of struggled a bit, I think, because I thought, well, who is this man? We don't know why you love him so much, but he just sounds kind of awful, to be honest, to put you through this and to...
It's a very problematic relationship on lots of levels, and you really just wanted to get out of it. But Elizabeth Smart, was
Dump
so
him!
Interesting. That's the thing that carried me through it.
I really wanted to know more about her life in advertising, and I love how that bubbles through at the end. But this guy, George Sands, the poet... His second wife was not Elizabeth Smart, who he probably should have married, although I don't know. It was Elspeth Barker, author of Notes from the Hen House and O Caledonia. So I brought lover and love rival away with me completely unwittingly.
Oh, yeah. I see what you mean. Yes, because Elspeth Barker seemed to manage to really make a go of a relationship with this quite strange, awkward, difficult man. O Caledonia, amazing, and I haven't got round to reading Notes from a Hen House, but I would love to get to it one day. Still to come from Daisy, how to get over a bad case of book limerence, how she keeps on top of her TBR, and the one book from more than 200 recommended in Read Yourself Happy that she would read above all others. But before we get to that, a quick aside about what's going on with the pod's Patreon community. If you sign up to support the show there, you'll get a regular extra minisode made just for subscribers to fill those gaps between the main shows. Here Laura and I talk about our one book wonders, the books we read that lead to a message in our WhatsApp. I've just read this and I'm dying to talk about it. Speaking of messages, our podcast chat group is busy with recommendations as the members and I swap notes on our current reads. And at the higher tier, you can join me live for the podcast book club. In March, we're reading Hate Ship, Friendship, Courtship, Love Ship, Marriage by Alice Munro. My first time reading the Canadian Nobel Prize winner, and we'll shortly be voting on the titles for April, May and June, so come and help us decide. We meet on the last Sunday of each month over Zoom with a catch-up episode posted for any book clubbers who couldn't make the live session. All that plus a read-along of War and Peace that's open to all, and I'm currently wondering what long classic we might tackle next. Join us and have a say. Head to patreon.com/The Book Club Review for all the details, link in the show notes. There's a 7-day free trial, so you can give it a go and see what you think. If you're a Substacker, you can also subscribe there. Find out more at substack.com/The Book Club Review. I wanted to flag up a lovely thing I thought you wrote about the psychological state of limerence that we can fall into through reading. I mean, anyone would be familiar with it. It can happen with anything, can't it? It can happen with a TV show that you really love where you find yourself falling in love with the main character. But there's just something about the experience when you really fall in love with the characters in a book, you fall in love with the world and you live it. And then you finish. And it's hard, I think, getting over a case of limerence. It's what we pan for the whole time, isn't it? We're always looking for those books that sort of spark that. But then when you experience it, it can be really hard sometimes to let go and move away from that world and come back into the real world. And then difficult to start reading something else, I find sometimes.
It's such a delicious teenage feeling when you want to tell everyone and say, this is making me so happy. It's so great. I feel so good and they're wonderful. And you believe it all. I had it really strongly when I was reading Happy all the time. I remember I was reading it in the bath and I got to the end, and I don't want to give too much away, but it's a book that is largely devoid of plot, so there's not a whole lot to give away. But it really is realising the 4 people are together and happy, eating their fish, and that is where we leave them. And I burst into tears. It felt like breaking the surface too fast. I didn't want to be away from their world. And I think I still have that whenever I finish it, even though I love going back to it. around this time last year, I think, I was feeling a little bit January down in the dumps, had a cold I couldn't get rid of. And I found online, I don't know if you know Noel Stratfield's Gemma books, which are books for younger readers.
I missed those.
Classic Noel Stratfield territory. Gemma was a Hollywood child star. Her mother, Rowena, is a movie star. They live in the States. Rowena gets a big job. She's a sort of inconsistent mother. Gemma is too old to be a child star and too young to be an actress. So she gets palmed off on Rowena's sister, Alice, and her family, who live in a little town called Headstone. And Gemma thinks, oh, I have to go to these awful provincial basic people. I'll show them and be all movie starish. Not knowing that the three siblings are very, very talented. And of course, they go off and form a kind of family band and have adventures. And there's lots of that ballet shoesy kind of, lots of child labour, which I'm very much in favour of. But I think there are 4 books and I loved having them all and knowing I didn't have to move out of the world, that I could stay there for as long as I needed to stay there.
I had a bit over Christmas. I found a set of The Dark is Rising, the Susan Cooper books, in the charity shop, and I'd reread The Dark is Rising last winter. Had a bit of a moment, didn't it, that book? And I'd really enjoyed rereading it, but I hadn't thought to read any of the others. And then I idly picked up these books, thinking, oh, it'd be nice to have those. And then I can't remember which one. I think it was Greenwich I was reading, and it just completely transported me in space and time to being curled up in my bedroom and reading those books for the first time in the loveliest way. And it was about being back in that world with that voice, with those characters. You can't get that any other way, right? It's such a magical thing. And we find it in books.
Magic is the word. It's an extraordinary experience. And I think it's the only way we can really get to time travel. And I think for anyone who, I can't imagine any listeners are maybe having this, but I do think that if you're in a reading drought, that one of the best ways to break it is to go back, try to think back to that book you loved, because there will be one that felt like it was for you, and just revisit that person.
Do you read more than one book at a time, or do you tend to have more than one on the go?
I think at the moment I'm reading about 3. I am in the mornings reading, I'm reading this brilliant book. All I can think of is that the cover is bright pink with a very curvaceous pair of bright red pants on, and the writer's called Robert, and it is based on La Boheme, and it's a big queer comedy about a housewife who becomes embroiled in the gay scene in 70s New York and befriends a porn star, and it's really brilliant and really funny. And I wish I could remember what it's called. I know the first name of the guy is Robert. I think it's called Love Junkie. It's just come to me. And also,
Robert Novel Pants was not bringing it up for me in Google.
I brought up quite some interesting things, though. My comfort read at the moment is, again, Rachel by Marion Keyes, which I felt the urge to pick up the other day, and I read it in the bath. And I'm reading my friend's new novel, which is about to go out on submission, which is a really lovely thing about knowing lots of writers, is you do get to read these things out. So that reading pile is enormous, and it's a lovely thing and a privilege to be asked to read things early doors. But I do try to make sure I'm also reading something that is just not necessarily something that's just come out or that everyone's reading. And I try to do my most challenging new book in the morning. But then with Love Junkie, it's really nice to have something to look forward to because it's so funny.
And I imagine your TBR pile is more vertiginous than most. How do you manage that?
Oh, good Lord. I was just reading something in New York Mag about billionaire closet organisers and thinking, that's what I need. I need help. It's so hard to give books away. It's impossible to have enough storage space because there's just so many. I make piles of the piles. Yeah, I would love to figure it out and organise it. I just saw my friend Tilly on Instagram has librarian trolleys, and I think I might need to just get some librarian trolleys. I think that's the only way.
Do you worry about all the books that you want to get to, but there won't be time? How do you manage that sense of just so many books that you want to read, but it's impossible to read everything?
I definitely get that overwhelm of, oh, well, where do I begin? What do I read next? Because there is so much. And I think, because, you were saying about not necessarily reading all the books you love, and a bit like with that Elspeth Barker, which I didn't start when I was away, because I sort of think, oh, but I know I'll love this, so shall I save it? Like, why? Why am I saving it? And it's funny so I really, really love Persephone books. I'm sure you know the reissues of mid-century classics.
With the dove grey covers.
Yeah, they are beautiful things. I just read Expiation by Elizabeth von Arnhem, who wrote The Enchanted April, and that was surprisingly funny and surprisingly sad. And it took me a minute to get into it, but when I did, I adored it. It's very funny on marriage and monogamy. And that because I just bought it, I know sometimes what I do with Persephone books is if I'm anywhere near the shop, I'll go and gorge myself on them and take them home and then look at them on the shelf and think, aren't they lovely? And I suppose perhaps because they are so chic, but they don't jump out at you. But after reading that, I thought, why don't I just read? Because I've definitely got Persephone books that I love that I haven't read yet. I love Dorothy Whipple, and I'm a bit scared about coming to the end of Dorothy Whipple. So I really want to read They Were Sisters, but I haven't, because then I think that might be the last one. Oh, I've not read Greenbanks. It's fine. I might read They Were Sisters now.
I feel like this is probably going to be a really hard question, and maybe you've already talked about it, but I was just wondering if there was one book from Read Yourself Happy that you would love listeners to read, if they were going to read only one of all these fantastic recommendations.
Because, yeah, someone did just say there are over 200 books in this book. And I thought, I didn't realise that there's so much going on in here.
Well, there's not only your own recommendations, but there's a lovely little extra section you get at the end where you then go through the recommendations people have given you on your books, which is like another lovely, generative, yet more book recommendations.
It is a very hard question. I mean, the book that I think has done the most for me in terms of my own happiness and mental health is probably Rachel's Holiday by Marion Keyes, because I do reread it often and I take something new from it every time. But then I feel very strongly about The Pursuit of Love by Nancy Mitford. I feel very, very strongly about Rivals. So, yeah, if I had to narrow it down to 3, if you were to say you're only allowed to read of the 200 recommended, one book, I would take Rachel's Holiday and then I would cram Pursuit of Love and Rivals into it somehow.
I'm almost slightly scared to admit to you that I have never read any Marion Keyes, which I feel to be a real failing. I have, thanks to you, spent the week absolutely devouring The Flat Share by Beth O'Leary, which even I was like, how can I never have read The Flat Share? But you flagging it up in the book. And I happened to be in Waterstones. It was right there. I was like, okay, I should give this a go. And I cannot tell you how much pleasure tearing through this book has given me. It's so good.
Bit of limerence. And sometimes it does feel like a sign, I think, when a book nudges its way into our conscience enough times.
It's a great romance. It's clever writing. It's funny. It's full of these brilliant little observations. And that is what I want from a romance. I want it to be good in that way. And this really was, I thought.
Have you read any Vari McFarlane?
I have not.
Because she's similarly so smart, really, really brilliant on supporting characters. Very interesting, lovable, flawed, grown-up women with lives, which I think is what you get from Marion Keyes as well. So let The Flat Share be your gateway, I'd say.
I feel like this is a rich theme and I'm very happy to start writing it. So thank you. And thank you for writing this wonderful book. Feels very appropriate to be thinking about it around Valentine's Day because the whole book is about love, isn't it? It's a love of reading, one that's shared among readers everywhere. We know that while life can have its ups and downs and the world remains an uneasy place, there is one thing we can be sure of, and that's the joy we find in books. And I loved your line at the end, which really stayed with me, that readers are all optimists, because we believe that the next book we open might be our best yet. And I thought, yes, that's true. I hadn't thought of it that way, but we are, aren't we? We're optimists.
It's true. Sometimes I need to be reminded that I'm an optimist, but I really am.
It was wonderful, and thank you so much for coming and talking to me on the podcast about it today.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
That's nearly it for this episode. You'll find all the books mentioned in the show notes and at the episode page on our website at thebookclubreview.co.uk. While you're there, check out our archive. It's up to 170 episodes now, and in my opinion, everyone is a gem. If you love the show, don't forget you can support me in making it and get masses of extras if you sign up via Patreon. Head to patreon.com/thebookclubreview for all the details, or substack.com/thebookclubreview. Remember those reading lamps I love? If you're interested to give them a try, visit seriousreaders.com/BCR and you can take advantage of our offer code BCR, which will give you £150 off any HT Lite and free UK delivery. And if you were intrigued by book lovers dating, head to www.booklovers.dating and remember to use the referral code BookClubReview for 10% off. If you want to catch up with me between episodes, come and find me on Instagram or Threads at Book Club Review Podcast. But for now, until next time, I wish you happy reading and happy book clubbing.